If you dug up your backyard tomorrow and unearthed a pristine, fully functioning smartphone buried inside a fossilized dinosaur nest, you would probably have a few questions. You would also be called a liar by every person with a PhD in history. The people who write history textbooks have a long tradition of looking at physical, undeniable evidence, crossing their arms, and declaring that it simply cannot exist because it does not fit the current filing system. We like to think of science as a clean, objective march toward the truth, where new facts are welcomed with open arms and a celebratory glass of sherry. In reality, it behaves a lot more like a stubborn homeowner refusing to admit the lawnmower is broken. For centuries, the academic establishment has built comfortable careers on neat, tidy timelines. They decided when humans learned to farm, when we learned to write, who sailed where, and what our ancestors were capable of building. The only problem is that history is buried in the dirt, and the dirt does not care about tenure. When the dirt finally spoke, it did not just nudge the timeline. It grabbed the textbooks, tore out the pages, and set them on fire. To understand how the scientific establishment gets things wrong, you have to understand the dogma of the spade. This is the quiet, comfortable belief that the timeline of human history in our modern textbooks is essentially complete, with only a few minor details left to polish. It is the academic equivalent of declaring that all the major songs have already been written, and now we are just arguing over the track list. This mindset is not born out of malice. It is born out of the natural human desire to protect one's own brand. If you have spent 40 years writing books, delivering lectures, and grading papers based on the absolute certainty that ancient humans were simple, spear-throwing nomads who could barely manage a mud hut, you are not going to be thrilled when someone shows up with a 20-ton carved stone pillar from the Ice Age. Your immediate reaction will not be scientific curiosity. It will be a desperate defense of your life's work. This institutional bias creates a massive, invisible wall. The gatekeepers of history stand on top of this wall, armed with peer-reviewed journals and polite sneers, ready to pour hot oil on anyone who suggests that maybe our ancestors were smarter than we think. This creates a bizarre tension. On one side, you have the academic establishment, which values caution, credentials, and the preservation of the status quo. On the other side, you have the dreamers, the amateurs, and the flat-out eccentrics, who read ancient legends not as fairy tales, but as roadmaps. For a long time, the mainstream view was that if a story was old, it was probably made up. If a text mentioned a lost city, a great war, or a distant land across the sea, it was dismissed as nationalistic poetry, religious allegory, or the ancient equivalent of a comic book. The experts assured us that the ancients were simple folk who loved to exaggerate. Until, of course, someone went out with a shovel and proved that the legends were actually just news reports. Let us begin with the search for a city that academics swore was nothing more than a bedtime story. By the mid-19th century, the academic consensus on Homer's Iliad was absolute. It was a beautiful work of fiction. The Trojan War, the wooden horse, Achilles, Hector, and the great city of Troy itself were as real as Mount Olympus and the Cyclops. Scholars argued that the Bronze Age Greeks were too primitive to mount a massive, multi-year naval expedition across the Aegean Sea, and that Troy was merely a symbolic setting for a legendary showdown. The prevailing theory was that Homer had simply invented the city to give his characters somewhere to fight. Enter Heinrich Schliemann. Schliemann was not an archaeologist. He was a retired German businessman who had made a massive fortune in Russian war profiteering and California gold rush banking. He was wealthy, arrogant, highly eccentric, and completely obsessed with the Iliad. He had read the poem as a child and decided that Troy was a real place and that he was the man destined to find it. He took the text of the Iliad literally. If Homer wrote that a warrior could run around the walls of Troy 3 times in an afternoon, Schliemann went to northwestern Turkey, found the suspected sites, and walked the landscape with a stopwatch to see if the geography matched the poetry. The mainstream academic community watched this with a mixture of amusement and horror. They mocked him in journals. They called him a gullible amateur, a merchant with a midlife crisis, and a fool who was chasing fairy tales with a checkbook. They told him that if he wanted to find Troy, he might as well go look for the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Schliemann did not care. In the 1870s, he focused his attention on a massive mound called Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey. He was convinced that this hill, situated near key waterways, was the site of ancient Troy. But Schliemann did not have the patience for modern, meticulous archaeological methods. He did not want to brush away dust with a toothbrush. He wanted results. He hired a small army of local laborers and decided that the best way to find the Homeric Troy was to dig a massive, brutal trench right through the center of the mound. He literally used dynamite. He blasted his way through the soil, shattering walls, crushing pottery, and obliterating the delicate upper layers of the site. It was an archaeological crime scene. In his rush to find the Troy of the Iliad, which lay in the middle layers of the mound, he blasted right past it and destroyed crucial evidence of the very city he was looking for. But his crude methods did yield something spectacular. Deep in the trench, Schliemann spotted a glint of gold. He dismissed his workers, and alongside his Greek wife, Sophia, he began digging with his hands. He pulled out a hoard of ancient jewelry, diadems, necklaces, and silver vessels. He immediately declared this to be Priam's treasure, the wealth of the legendary king of Troy. He took a photograph of Sophia draped in the gold jewelry of Helen of Troy, sent it to the international press, and watched the academic world choke on their own words. The scholars had to admit they were wrong. Troy was not a myth. It was a real city buried under the soil of Turkey. Schliemann's brute force methods had forced academics to rewrite Bronze Age history, even if he had dynamited half of it to pieces in the process. The ruins at Hisarlik stood as physical proof that the Iliad was rooted in historical reality, forcing the scientific establishment to accept that ancient poetry could contain literal truth. While the discovery of Troy showed that legends could be real, another historical dogma was hardening into concrete on the other side of the Atlantic. For generations, school children were taught a simple, unshakable truth. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and he was the very first European to set eyes on the Americas. Yes, there were millions of indigenous people already living there, but as far as European discovery was concerned, Columbus held the crown. This was not just a popular story, it was an academic fortress. Anyone who suggested otherwise was viewed as a conspiracy theorist or a romantic crank. Yet, sitting in medieval libraries in Iceland and Denmark were the Icelandic sagas, specifically the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red. Written down in the 13th century, these sagas detailed the voyages of Norse explorers like Leif Erikson, who, around the year 1000, sailed west from Greenland and found a new, fertile land they called Vinland. The sagas described a place with wild grapes, self-sowing wheat, rivers full of salmon, and frost-free winters. Mainstream historians dismissed these stories as nationalistic folklore. They argued that the Vikings were excellent coastal raiders, but their open-decked, shallow-draft longships were completely incapable of surviving the brutal, open waters of the North Atlantic to establish a permanent colony in North America. The sagas were treated like the stories of King Arthur, fun to read, but useless for history. The academic establishment maintained that there was no physical evidence of a Norse presence in the Americas, and therefore the voyages to Vinland were purely mythical. In 1960, a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad and his wife, archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad, decided that the sagas were not bedtime stories. They believed the Norse descriptions of the coastline, the sailing times, and the landmarks were too specific to be fabricated. They began a systematic search of the Atlantic coast of North America, sailing from Labrador southward, looking for any trace of an ancient settlement. They did not look for stone castles. They looked for the subtle depressions in the earth that might indicate ancient turf houses. When they reached the northern tip of Newfoundland, they stopped in a tiny, isolated fishing village called Elance Aux Meadows. Helge asked the locals if they knew of any strange mounds or ruins in the area. A local resident named George Decker walked them over to a group of overgrown, grassy ridges near the shore. The locals had always assumed they were old Indian ruins. And Steiningstad began a careful, scientific excavation of the site. As they peeled back the sod, they did not find indigenous artifacts. They found the foundations of 8 turf-walled buildings, built in the exact style of Norse longhouses from Greenland and Iceland. They found a blacksmith's forge, complete with a stone anvil and iron slag. This was the smoking gun. The indigenous populations of Newfoundland did not smelt iron. The excavators also found a bronze ringed pin, a soapstone spindle whorl, and worked wood that had been cut with iron tools. The dating of the site matched the sagas perfectly, around the year 1000. The academic establishment had no choice but to surrender. The Norse sagas were historical documents, and Christopher Columbus was officially demoted to second place in the European discovery race, beaten by a crew of wooden ship sailing Scandinavians by 500 years. The discovery at Elance Aux Meadows proved that the Vinland sagas were not myths, but accounts of actual historical events. But while the Vikings were conquering the Atlantic, an even more shocking challenge to the historical timeline was sitting at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea, disguised as a crusty green rock. In 1900, a group of Greek sponge divers was blown off course by a storm and took shelter near the tiny island of Antikythera. When the storm cleared, they decided to dive the local waters. One of the divers, Elias Stadiades, plunged down to a depth of about 150 feet and quickly surfaced in a panic, babbling about a heap of dead, rotting bodies on the seafloor. What he had actually found was the wreck of a massive Roman cargo ship that had sunk in the 1st century BCE, loaded with luxury goods. The Greek government launched a salvage operation, pulling up treasures, marble statues, bronze sculptures, jewelry, and ancient coins. Among these works of art was a calcified, corroded lump of bronze and wood about the size of a shoebox. The archaeologists at the National Archaeological Museum in Athens did not know what to make of it. It looked like a rotten piece of junk. They focused all their attention on cleaning the beautiful statues of gods and heroes, while the mysterious green lump was placed in a cardboard box and left to dry out in a basement corner. In 1902, an archaeologist named Valerios Stais was examining the collection when he noticed that the dry air had caused the green lump to crack open. Inside, he saw the unmistakable outlines of tiny, precision-cut gear wheels. Stais announced his discovery, and the academic world immediately went into denial. The reaction was not just skepticism, it was outright rejection. According to the mainstream timeline of technology, complex gear-based machinery did not exist in the ancient world. The first geared clocks and astronomical devices were believed to have been invented in Europe in the 14th century CE. If the Greeks had gears in the 2nd century BCE, it meant that humanity had somehow developed advanced mechanical technology, lost it completely for 1500 years, and then had to reinvent it from scratch. This did not fit the comfortable narrative of linear human progress. For decades, mainstream scholars tried to explain the object away. Some claimed it was a modern clock that had accidentally fallen off a passing ship and landed on top of the ancient wreck. Others argued it was a medieval astrolabe that had been dropped by a sailor. They simply could not accept that ancient Greeks possessed the mathematical and engineering skills to create such a device. It was not until the late 20th century, when researchers began using advanced X-ray and CT imaging on the corroded fragments, that the true nature of the Antikythera mechanism was revealed. The device contained at least 30 interlocking bronze gears, all cut with precision and housed in a wooden case covered in astronomical inscriptions. It was not a simple clock, it was a highly complex analog computer. By turning a hand crank, the user could calculate the exact positions of the sun, the moon, and the 5 known planets. It predicted solar and lunar eclipses, tracked the 4-year cycle of the Olympic Games, and even accounted for the irregular orbit of the moon. The technology was so advanced that nothing of equal complexity would appear in the historical record for another millennium and a half. The academic establishment had to admit that their timeline of human technology was not a straight line going up, but a jagged peak that had collapsed into a dark age. The Antikythera mechanism stood as an undeniable physical refutation of the idea that ancient civilizations were technologically simple. The history of archaeology is not just a story of honest mistakes and stubborn resistance to new ideas. Sometimes, the establishment's desire to prove their own theories correct leads them straight into the most embarrassing traps imaginable. And there is no greater example of this than the infamous saga of the Piltdown man. In the early 20th century, the field of human evolution was in a state of intense nationalistic rivalry. The French had discovered the Neanderthal, and the Germans had found the Heidelberg man. The British scientific establishment was feeling deeply insecure. They were the masters of a global empire, yet they had no ancient human ancestors to call their own. They desperately wanted to prove that the birthplace of humanity was not in Africa or continental Europe, but in the green fields of England. They also had a pet theory, that the human brain evolved first, growing larger before the rest of the body lost its ape-like features. In 1912, an amateur archaeologist named Charles Dawson claimed to have found the perfect specimen in a gravel pit in Piltdown, East Sussex. He presented a collection of skull fragments, a jawbone, and a few primitive stone tools to Arthur Smith Woodward, the keeper of geology at the British Natural History Museum. Woodward was thrilled. The skull was thick and human-like, indicating a large brain, while the jawbone was distinctly ape-like, with 2 worn molar teeth. It was the perfect missing link that British science had been searching for. They named it Eanthropus dawsoni, or Dawson's Dawn Man, but the public knew it simply as the Piltdown man. The British scientific establishment embraced the find with uncritical enthusiasm. It was presented to the Geological Society of London, hailed as the most important discovery in the history of human evolution. The few foreign scientists who raised doubts were politely ignored or dismissed as jealous rivals. The French and German scientists pointed out that the jawbone looked suspiciously like that of a modern chimpanzee or orangutan, and that the wear on the teeth did not match the wear pattern of a human jaw. But the British experts, blinded by national pride and confirmation bias, defended the find for over 40 years. They put the bones in a locked vault in the museum, limiting access to only a select group of trusted scholars. Anyone who wanted to examine the fossils had to work with plaster casts rather than the original bones, making close inspection nearly impossible. The Piltdown man became a cornerstone of human evolutionary theory, printed in textbooks and lectured on in universities worldwide. Despite the fact that it was a complete lie, the House of Cards finally collapsed in 1953, when a new generation of scientists, armed with modern chemical testing methods, got their hands on the original bones. They performed a fluorine absorption test, which measures the amount of fluorine absorbed from the surrounding soil to determine the age of the bone. The results were humiliating. The skull fragments and the jawbone did not have the same amount of fluorine. They were not even the same age. The skull was indeed human, but it was only a few hundred years old, likely from a medieval cemetery. The jawbone was not human at all. It belonged to a modern orangutan. The hoaxer had taken the orangutan jaw, broken off the parts that connect to the skull to hide the fact that it did not fit, filed down the teeth with a metal file to make them look like they had worn down from chewing human food, and stained all the pieces with iron and chromic acid to make them match the color of the ancient gravel pit. They had even planted a fossilized elephant tooth that had been imported from Tunisia. The Piltdown man was not a missing link. It was a cheap, high school-level arts and crafts project. The scientific establishment had been fooled for 4 decades, not because the hoax was clever, but because they wanted it to be true. It fit their theories, it fed their national pride, and it allowed them to ignore the real, messy evidence of human evolution that was being discovered in Africa. But the ultimate blow to academic certainty did not come from a hoax in England or a shipwreck in Greece. It came from a dusty hilltop in southeastern Turkey, and it completely inverted our understanding of how human civilization began. For nearly a century, the foundational narrative of human history was the agricultural revolution. The story went like this. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans were simple, nomadic hunter-gatherers. They wandered in small bands, chasing wild animals and gathering plants, living hand-to-mouth. Then, around 10,000 years ago, someone figured out how to plant wheat. This spark of genius led to agriculture. Agriculture meant people could settle down in permanent villages. Permanent villages led to food surpluses. Food surpluses meant that not everyone had to spend all day looking for food, which allowed for the division of labor. Only after they settled down and built stable societies did they have the time, the resources, and the social organization to build monumental architecture, temples, and cities. Religion and complex society were the luxury products of farming. This was the gospel of anthropology. It was taught in every university, printed in every textbook, and accepted as absolute fact. Then, in 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt visited a site in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe, which translates to Potbelly Hill. The site had been surveyed in the 1960s by American archaeologists, who saw some limestone slabs sticking out of the dirt, assumed it was an abandoned medieval cemetery, and moved on. Schmidt looked at the limestone slabs and realized they were much, much older. He began to dig. What he found beneath the soil was mind-boggling. He uncovered massive circular stone enclosures, each containing giant, T-shaped limestone pillars. Some of these pillars stood 20 feet tall and weighed up to 20 tons. They were not crude rocks. They were beautifully carved with high-relief sculptures of wild animals, vipers, scorpions, lions, boars, and foxes. The pillars were arranged in concentric circles, buried deep within the hillside. Schmidt and his team performed radiocarbon dating on the organic materials found at the site. The results came back, and the archaeological community gasped. The site dated to around 9600 BCE. That is 11,600 years ago. To put that in perspective, Göbekli Tepe was built 7,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza. It was built 6,000 years before Stonehenge. It was built at a time when there were no metal tools, no pottery, no writing, and most importantly, no agriculture. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were nomadic hunter-gatherers who lived in the Stone Age. They had no domesticated crops, no beasts of burden, and no permanent homes. Yet they somehow managed to organize hundreds of people, feed them, coordinate their labor, transport 20-ton stones from nearby quarries without wheels, and carve them with exquisite artistic detail. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe did not just nudge the timeline of history, it flipped it completely upside down. The old theory was that farming led to temples. Göbekli Tepe proved that the temples came first. The new theory, proposed by Schmidt and now widely accepted, is that the desire to build these massive, sacred spaces drew nomadic bands together from hundreds of miles away. To feed the thousands of workers gathered to construct and maintain these temples, they had to find a more reliable, concentrated food source than wild grasses and hunted game. They began to domesticate the wild wheat that grew on the hillsides. The temple invented the farm. The academic establishment spent years trying to find alternative explanations, searching desperately for evidence of agricultural settlements nearby, but they found nothing. The Stone Age nomads had built the world's first monumental architecture, forcing us to admit that our ancestors were capable of complex social organization long before they ever planted a single seed. So, when did the scientific establishment have to admit they got history wrong? The answer is constantly, reluctantly, and usually only when they are cornered by a mountain of dirt. From the buried streets of Troy to the T-shaped pillars of Göbekli Tepe, the Earth has a habit of spitting out facts that do not care about academic consensus. We like to think of our current understanding of the past as a solid, permanent structure. But history shows us that it is more like a sandcastle, constantly being reshaped by the next wave of discoveries. The next time you read a textbook that claims to have the human story completely figured out, just remember the retired businessman who bought a stopwatch to find a myth, the cardboard box in a museum basement that held an ancient computer, and the giant stone pillars built by people who had not even figured out how to plant a seed.